My name is Walter Higgins, and I spent 40 minutes sitting in my truck in a hotel parking garage in my one good suit, holding a card I'd bought for my son's graduation, before a security guard at the ballroom door told me, as gently as he could manage, that my name wasn't on the list. I want to start there, at that door, because that's the moment everything I thought understood about my son's marriage came apart in my hands. But to understand how a father ends up standing outside his own son's graduation dinner, holding an unopened card, I have to back up considerably further than that Saturday evening in April. I'd driven 6 hours from Millbrook to get there, left the shop at 4 in the morning so I could make the noon commencement ceremony at the university, which I did. Sitting up in the family section with a program in my lap, clapping until my hands hurt when they called my son's name. Daniel Robert Higgins, Master of Business Administration, with distinction, and watching him cross that stage in a black gown that still somehow looked, to me, like the same skinny kid who used to hand me wrenches under the Chevy in our garage on Saturday mornings. I'd gotten a hotel room 2 nights before so I wouldn't be rushed, wouldn't be tired, wouldn't embarrass him by showing up road-weary and rumpled. I'd bought a new tie. I want that detail on the record because everything that happened after the ceremony makes a lot more sense once you understand how much thought went into simply making sure I looked right for that day. The ceremony itself had been fine. Better than fine, it had been one of the best afternoons of my life, if I'm honest. I'd sat in a folding chair under a white tent with 3,000 other families, sweating through my new shirt in the April sun, straining to pick out my own son's face among 400 identical black gowns. And when they finally called his name, Daniel Robert Higgins, Master of Business Administration, with distinction, I stood up out of my seat before I'd consciously decided to, clapping loud enough that the woman beside me laughed and told me she could tell exactly whose father I was. Danny had found me in the crowd afterward, still in his gown, sweat damp and grinning, and hugged me the way he used to hug me as a boy, tight and a little too long, his chin briefly resting on my shoulder the way it hadn't since he was maybe 14 years old and still short enough to fit there naturally. "Dad, you made it. You actually made it. Wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. Son, I know you drove all night for this. 4 in the morning, I said. Worth every mile of it." He told me he was glad I'd made it, and I remember thinking, standing there in that crowd of families taking photographs, cameras flashing all around us, mortarboards still scattered across the lawn from where they'd been thrown in the air 20 minutes earlier, that whatever distance had crept into our relationship since he'd married Vanessa 2 years earlier was about to close for good, that this weekend was going to be the start of something better between all 3 of us. I had no idea, standing in that sunlit crowd with my son's arms still around my shoulders, how wrong that particular feeling was about to turn out to be, or how right it would eventually become again, months later, by a considerably harder road than either of us expected to walk that afternoon. There was a private dinner planned that evening at a hotel ballroom downtown, hosted by Vanessa's family. Her father owns a chain of orthodontic practices across 3 counties, the kind of man who says "we" when he means my accountant, celebrating not just Danny's graduation but, as I understood it, the 2 of them together, since Vanessa had finished her own graduate program the same semester. I had a printed invitation. I want to be clear about that too. It had come in the mail 6 weeks earlier, cream cardstock, my name spelled correctly, a response card I'd mailed back the same week. I wasn't crashing anything. I had been asked. I got to the hotel 40 minutes before the dinner was set to start, parked in the garage, sat in my truck for a few minutes collecting myself the way I always do before something that matters to me, checking my collar in the visor mirror, practicing, a little foolishly, the short toast I'd been turning over in my head in case anyone asked me to say a few words the way they had at the wedding. I remember the particular quality of that 40 minutes. The ordinary hum of a parking garage, other families walking past my windshield in cocktail dresses and pressed shirts, laughing about nothing in particular. Everyone else's night already unfolding exactly the way they expected it to. I had no reason, sitting there, to expect mine would go any differently. I walked into the lobby in my suit, card in hand, and gave my name to a young man in a black vest standing at the ballroom entrance with a tablet in his hands. "Higgins," I said. "Walter Higgins. Father of the groom, well, Danny's father." He scrolled for a moment, scrolled again, and I watched his face do the thing faces do when they're trying to figure out how to deliver bad news to someone who clearly isn't expecting it. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not showing a Walter Higgins on tonight's list. Let me get my supervisor. I stood there in that hallway for what felt considerably longer than the actual few minutes it took, watching through the ballroom's glass doors as round tables filled up with people in cocktail attire, string lights, a jazz trio setting up in the corner, and I remember the particular, specific humiliation of standing outside a party thrown in honor of my own son while other guests walked past me with their own invitations in hand, glancing at me the way you glance at someone standing somewhere they don't seem to belong. The supervisor came, checked again, confirmed the same thing. Not on the list. I asked if I could simply call my son, and she said, of course, clearly uncomfortable now herself, and I stepped away from the door and called Danny's cell phone, and it rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I texted him instead. Hey son, I'm downstairs, they don't have me on the list, can you come get me? I watched that message sit there, delivered but not yet read, for 6 full minutes, standing in a hotel hallway in my one good suit, before 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice. And then finally, a response, Dad, I'm so sorry, there was a mix-up with the final guest count. It's a really tight room tonight. Can we get breakfast tomorrow before you head back? I'll explain everything. I read that message 4 times. I want to be honest about what I felt reading it, because I think it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. I didn't feel angry, not yet. I felt something closer to confusion, the particular disorientation of a fact that doesn't fit anywhere in the story you'd been telling yourself about your own life. I texted back that it was fine, that I understood, that I'd see him in the morning, and I have said those 2 phrases to my son enough times over the years. It was fine, I understand, that I sometimes wonder whether they've become less of a truth and more of a reflex, the thing you say when something comes at you too fast to properly feel yet. I drove back to my hotel room, hung my new tie over the back of a chair, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the television, listening to the sound of a city I didn't know outside a window that didn't open, holding an unopened graduation card with $40 folded inside it, the kind of quiet that makes you start noticing your own heartbeat. Around 9 that night, there was a knock at my hotel room door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I found Deb Ronan standing in the hallway, an old friend of mine and my late wife's from Millbrook, retired now from 30 years as a high school guidance counselor, who happened entirely by coincidence to be in the city that same weekend visiting her own granddaughter at the same university. Walt. She took one look at my face and didn't bother with hello. What happened? I didn't know, standing in that hotel doorway, that Deb Ronan was about to become the person who helped me see clearly what I couldn't quite see on my own that night. But to understand why her showing up mattered as much as it did, I need to explain a little more about who Danny and I actually were to each other, long before Vanessa entered the picture at all. I've run Higgins Auto Body on Route 9 in Millbrook for 31 years, took it over from my own father, who took it over from his. It's not a big operation, 4 bays, 6 employees counting me, the kind of shop where people bring their cars because their fathers brought their cars there and their grandfathers before that. We've got a coffee pot in the waiting area that's older than most of the cars we service, a bell over the door that still rings the same slightly off-key note it rang when I was a boy sweeping floors for my own father, and a wall behind the register covered in Little League photos of half the kids in Millbrook, going back 3 decades, because that's the kind of thing that accumulates when you stay in one place long enough to watch a whole town grow up around you. My longtime mechanic, Sal Ferrara, has worked beside me for 26 years, since he was 23 years old and fresh off 2 tours overseas, looking for something with his hands that didn't remind him too much of what he'd left behind. Sal's closer to a brother than an employee at this point, and it was Sal, more than almost anyone besides Deb, who I found myself talking to in the weeks after the graduation, standing over an open hood at the end of a long day, working through the same tangled feelings out loud that I couldn't quite untangle sitting still. My wife, Carol, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for 22 years, until the cancer took her when Danny was 17, and I raised him alone for his last year of high school and all through college, working the shop by day and learning, slowly, badly, how to be both parents to a boy who'd lost his mother far too young. Danny worked in that shop with me every summer from the time he was 12, sweeping floors before he was old enough to hold a wrench, learning the actual mechanics of an engine before he was old enough to drive one. He was smart in a way that made me proud, and a little uneasy at the same time, the kind of smart that was clearly going to take him somewhere beyond Route 9, and when he got into business school, with a scholarship that covered most of it. I remember standing in our kitchen reading that acceptance letter and crying in a way I hadn't cried since Carol's funeral, because some part of me understood, even then, that I was reading the first page of my son's life moving somewhere I couldn't fully follow him. I paid for what the scholarship didn't cover, out of the shop's slow years and my own retirement savings. $11,400 across 3 semesters, money I pulled from an account I'd been quietly building since Danny was in diapers. And never told him how much of a dent it put in either. Because that's simply what you do for your kid, the same way my own father had quietly covered the gap when I'd needed new equipment to keep the shop running in my 20s. One generation's sacrifice, folding into the next without either side ever needing to keep a ledger of it. I remember, too, the years right after Carol died, when it was just the 2 of us in that house, learning how to keep a family running on instinct alone. I didn't know how to braid a tie for his 8th grade band concert and had to watch a video on the shop computer between customers to figure it out. I burned more casseroles than I care to admit and eventually gave up entirely and just learned to make the 4 things Carol used to make over and over because Danny said they tasted like home and I didn't have it in me to disappoint him on top of everything else he'd already lost. He used to fall asleep some nights in the recliner next to mine watching old westerns, and I'd carry him up to bed the way I had when he was small, even long after he'd technically gotten too big for me to carry easily, because some part of me wasn't ready to admit he didn't need carrying anymore. Those years are the ones I think about most, even now, not because they were easy, but because they were the years when it was unmistakably clear, every single day, that he was mine to protect, and that I was the one he'd look for first in any room. Danny met Vanessa in his 2nd year of grad school, at a networking event I only ever heard about secondhand. She was finishing her own master's in something involving hospitality management, came from money in a way Danny hadn't grown up around, and I think if I'm honest, found genuinely dazzling at first. I met her exactly 4 times before their wedding 18 months ago. Once at a dinner Danny arranged in the city, once when they visited Millbrook for a weekend that lasted considerably less than a full weekend, once at their engagement party hosted by her parents at a country club I wasn't entirely sure I was dressed correctly for, and once at the wedding itself, where I gave a toast Danny had asked me to keep short. That first dinner in the city, Danny had picked a restaurant with a menu that didn't list a single price, which I noticed the moment I sat down and quietly decided not to mention. Vanessa arrived polished and warm, in the particular way people are warm when they're performing warmth for someone they're still deciding about. Asked me thoughtful questions about the shop, about Carol, about what Danny had been like as a boy, and laughed at the right moments in a way that felt, at the time, entirely genuine. I remember driving home that night thinking Danny had found himself someone sharp and kind, and telling Deb as much over the phone the following week, only half registering, even as I said it, the small detail that Vanessa had ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted first, a thing I'd chalked up at the time to simple confidence rather than anything worth examining more closely. I want to be fair to her here, because fairness matters to me in telling this. Vanessa was never openly unkind to my face, not once, in any of those 4 encounters. She was polished and pleasant, and asked me questions about the shop with what seemed like genuine, if slightly performed, interest. What I noticed, without being able to name it clearly at the time, was smaller than unkindness. It was the particular way she'd redirect conversations at family gatherings, whenever they drifted toward anything involving Route 9, or my hands, permanently stained in a way 30 years of grease doesn't fully wash out, or the fact that I said things like, "We don't got the parts in," instead of whatever version of that sentence her own father would have used. At the engagement party, held at a country club with a dress code printed on the invitation itself, I remember standing near a hors d'oeuvres table with a plate I didn't quite know what to do with, listening to Vanessa's father tell a story about a sailing trip to a group of men who all seemed to already know the ending, and Danny came and found me there, unprompted, and stood beside me for 20 minutes without saying much of anything, just being present, the way he used to stand beside me under a car on a Saturday morning without needing to fill the silence with words. That's the small, warm detail I held on to for a long time afterward, whenever the rest of it started feeling too heavy to carry, that whatever else was shifting underneath the surface of his new life, some part of my son still knew, instinctively, to come stand next to his father in a room that didn't quite fit him yet. At the wedding itself, Danny had asked me to keep my toast short, which I understood at the time as simple practicality, a wedding with a schedule to keep, a room full of people who didn't know me. I stood up in that reception hall, 180 guests according to the program, most of them strangers to me, and felt more nervous than I had at any point during my own wedding to Carol 30-some years earlier. I kept it to under 2 minutes, told one story about teaching him to change his first tire at 14 years old in our driveway, on a Sunday afternoon, one clean joke about how he used to think a torque wrench was a magic wand, one line about his mother that made more than a few people in that room reach for a napkin, and sat down to real applause that felt, in the moment, like enough. Vanessa hugged me afterward, told me it was the best toast of the night, and I remember believing her completely, the same uncomplicated way I believed most things people told me back then, before I'd learned to listen for the small gap between what people say and what they actually mean underneath it. I'd known Deb Ronan for over 30 years, since Carol first introduced us at a school function, back when Deb was still a young counselor and Carol a younger teacher, the two of them forming the kind of easy, decades-long friendship women sometimes build inside the same small institution. She'd lost her own husband, Frank Ronan, to a stroke 9 years back, and she and Carol had leaned on each other hard through both their losses. Close enough in the years since Carol died that Deb had become, without either of us ever formally deciding it, something like family to me too. 30 years in a guidance office teaches a person things most of us never have reason to learn. How to read a kid's silence for what it's actually hiding. How a family's version of events and a family's actual events can diverge without anyone in the family consciously lying. How conflict avoided in one generation tends to resurface sharper in the next one. She sat with me on the edge of that hotel bed that night, and I told her everything. The text, the closed doors, the room full of people in cocktail attire while I stood in a hallway holding a graduation card nobody was going to open. "Walt," she said, after I'd finished, "I spent 30 years watching families work through exactly this kind of thing, kids and in-laws, and who gets seated where at what table, and I want to tell you something I learned in every single one of those cases. Don't build the story yet. You've got one piece of information. You weren't on a list. Get the actual facts before you let your imagination finish the rest of it for you." She paused, folding her hands in her lap the way I remembered her doing at Carol's funeral, steady in a room full of people who weren't. I watched hundreds of families come apart over exactly this kind of moment, Walt, and I watched just as many come back together stronger than before. The difference was almost never who was right. It was whether somebody finally said the true thing out loud calmly, instead of either swallowing it forever or exploding with it the first chance they got. "He didn't even come get me himself," I said. "He sent a text." "I know," she said, "and that matters, and we're not going to pretend it doesn't. But get the facts first, Walt. Feelings without facts just go in circles all night, and you deserve to actually know what happened, not just guess at the worst version of it." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about that quiet flicker in Deb's voice, get the facts first, and turning over in my mind every small moment across 4 visits and 18 months of marriage that I'd noticed but never quite let myself examine directly. Danny came to my hotel room at 8 the next morning, alone, looking like a man who hadn't slept much either, carrying 2 coffees from the lobby shop like a peace offering he wasn't entirely sure would land. "Dad, I am so sorry about last night. There was a mix-up with the final head count. The venue has a hard cap, and by the time I found out you weren't on the list, the room was already locked in. I should have caught it earlier. I should have called you myself instead of texting." I took the coffee he offered and sat down across from him. "Danny, who put together the guest list?" He hesitated, just slightly, in a way I'd have missed if I hadn't spent the whole night lying awake specifically listening for exactly that kind of hesitation. "Vanessa's mom mostly handled logistics with the venue." "And you didn't check it yourself? Your own father's name?" "I trusted them to handle it right, Dad. I had finals and the ceremony, and I should have double-checked. I know that." "Was I actually supposed to be there, Danny? Before the cap, I mean. Before whatever happened, happened." "Of course you were, Dad. You're my father. Why would you even ask that?" I studied his face for a long moment, looking for whatever it is you look for in a grown son's face when you're trying to decide whether to believe him the way you believed him without question when he was 7 years old. I didn't find a clear answer. Not that morning. What I found instead was a version of Danny I recognized uncomfortably well, tired, a little evasive, saying the thing that would end the conversation fastest rather than the thing that was necessarily true. A habit I suspect he learned, if I'm honest with myself, at least partly from watching me do the same thing across plenty of harder conversations over the years. We ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant after that, and he told me about the job offer he'd accepted at a firm downtown, $92,000 a year to start, a number he said with the particular pride of a young man who still couldn't quite believe it applied to him. And for a while it felt almost like an ordinary morning between us. Coffee and eggs, and a son excited about his future, and I let myself sink into that feeling more than I probably should have, because I wanted badly for the previous night to have been exactly the small, forgivable accident he was describing. I want to note something here that I didn't fully register until later that same day, sitting with the conversation for hours afterward on the drive home. Danny's explanation implied a straightforward logistical error, a hard cap, a mix-up, the ordinary chaos of event planning. It would take me exactly 9 more days to learn that wasn't the full story, or even close to it. I told him it was fine. I told him I understood. I drove the 6 hours back to Millbrook that afternoon telling myself Deb was right, that I'd gotten ahead of myself, that a hard guest cap and a stressed 26-year-old planning his own celebration wasn't the same thing as being deliberately erased from it. That belief lasted almost exactly 9 days. The unraveling started, as these things often do, with something small and entirely accidental. Danny had left his laptop bag at my house during a quick visit the following weekend, dropping by to pick up some old textbooks he'd stored in my garage, and when I went to charge his phone for him, after he mentioned it was nearly dead, the kind of small thing a father does without thinking twice, a text notification lit up the screen from a name I recognized as one of his groomsmen, Pete, a friend of his since middle school who still lived in Millbrook. "Bro, I feel bad for your dad, TBH. Vanessa's mom really said that? I didn't mean to read further than that single line. And I want to be honest that I hesitated for a long moment before I did, because reading a message that wasn't addressed to me felt like a line I don't cross easily in my son's life or anyone else's. But something about that single sentence, "I feel bad for your dad, TBH, sat in my chest like a stone, and I tapped the screen before I'd fully decided to. The thread went back 3 weeks, well before the graduation weekend. "Pete, how's the guest list going for the dinner thing?" Danny, "Ugh, don't ask. Vanessa's mom is being weird about numbers." Pete, "Weird how?" Danny, "She basically said with the room being that small she wants it to feel a certain way, like polished, and I think she meant my dad wouldn't exactly fit that vibe, lol." Pete, "Wait, so not inviting your own dad, Danny. I mean, he'll still come to the actual graduation, obviously, just not the fancy dinner thing. It's not a big deal. He'll understand. My dad's chill about stuff like that." I sat on the edge of my own bed, in my own house, reading those words on my son's phone, and felt something considerably colder settle into my chest than anything I'd felt standing in that hotel hallway 9 days earlier. Not a hard cap, not a mix-up. A deliberate decision, discussed and agreed to in advance, that I wouldn't fit the vibe of my own son's celebration. I sat there for a long moment after reading it, the phone still warm in my hand, the charger cable dangling uselessly beside it, feeling something crack quietly open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. 9 days of telling myself Deb was right, that I'd gotten ahead of myself, that a hard guest cap was simply a hard guest cap. And here, in 3 lines of text between 2 26-year-olds who didn't know I'd ever see them, was the plain, unmanaged truth of it, sitting in black and white on a screen that wasn't meant for me. I didn't confront him that night. I want to explain why. Because I think it matters. Deb's voice was still sitting in my head from that hotel room. "Get the facts first. Walt, don't finish the story yourself." And one screenshot of one conversation, however clear it seemed, was still only one piece. I put his phone back exactly where I'd found it, said nothing when he came back through for the bag 20 minutes later, though I noticed my hands weren't quite steady when I handed it to him, and he didn't seem to notice, already halfway out the door talking about traffic on the way back. I mentioned it to Sal the next morning, standing over a Buick with its hood propped open, because I needed to say it out loud to somebody before it finished eating me alive from the inside. "You gonna say something to him?" Sal asked, not looking up from the alternator he was working loose. "Not yet. I want to know the whole shape of it first." Sal straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me the way he does when he's about to say something he's been sitting on for a while. "Walt, I've known you 26 years. I've watched you let things slide with that boy more times than I can count, and every time I figured it wasn't my business to say anything, But you asked, so I'll say it now. Sometimes waiting for the whole shape of something is just a nicer word for putting off something you're scared to say. Maybe, I said. But I'd rather be scared and right than fast and wrong. I called Deb that same evening instead. I read something I probably shouldn't have, I told her, and explained what I'd seen. Okay, she said. Now you actually have something. Not a guess. An actual fact. What do you want to do with it? I don't know yet. That's all right too, she said. You don't have to know tonight. But Walt, don't let this be the only piece you gather. If this is real, there's going to be more of it, and you deserve to see the whole shape of it before you decide anything. She was right, in a way that unsettled me more than it comforted me, because over the following 3 weeks, more of it did surface, each piece landing heavier than the last. The second piece came from my sister, Donna, who lives 2 towns over, and had been at Danny and Vanessa's for Easter dinner a month before the graduation, a gathering I hadn't been invited to that year because Danny had told me at the time, it was a small thing, just Vanessa's family this year, we'll do something together soon, Dad. Donna called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice careful in a way that told me before she'd said a single word that she'd been debating whether to make this call at all. Walt, I need to tell you something, and I've been going back and forth on it for weeks, but I think you need to hear it from me instead of finding out some other way. What is it, Donna? At Easter, Vanessa's mother made a comment. I don't think she realized I'm your sister, we'd only met once before, about how relieved she was the graduation dinner would be, and I'm quoting her here, Walt, a little more refined crowd than some of Danny's Millbrook people. And Vanessa laughed and said something about how you were sweet, but you'd probably show oop in your work boots and start talking about carburetors with her father's business partners. I sat with that for a long moment, the particular ache of hearing, secondhand, exactly how a room full of people had discussed you as a problem to be managed. Did Danny say anything? He laughed too, Walt. I don't think he even really registered it as unkind. I think he's gotten so used to that family's way of talking that he doesn't hear it the way we'd hear it. I asked her, my voice steadier than I felt, how many people were at that Easter dinner? 14, I think. It was a big spread. Vanessa's mom had the caterer set up a whole ham station. Walt, it must have run them close to $800 just in food. 14 people at a family Easter dinner I hadn't been told about, in a conversation where I'd apparently been discussed as a liability to be managed for an upcoming event, 4 weeks before that event happened exactly the way it had been planned to. Walt, I have to ask you something, Donna said, her voice dropping into the particular register she'd used with me since we were kids, the one that meant she wasn't going to let something slide just because it was uncomfortable. Why haven't you said anything to Danny about any of this? You've been sitting on the hotel thing for almost 3 weeks now. I'm trying to get the full picture before I say anything I can't take back. I understand that, she said. But Walt, I've watched you do this exact thing our whole lives. Dad used to walk all over you, and you'd swallow it for months before you ever said a word, and by the time you finally said something, you'd usually swallowed so much that it came out sideways instead of clean. Don't do that with your own son. He's not going to fix something he doesn't know is broken. I sat with that longer than I wanted to admit, because my sister has never once in 61 years been wrong about the shape of my own stubbornness. The third piece came 6 days after Donna's call, and it arrived the way most of the worst discoveries do, sideways, while I wasn't looking for anything at all. I'd been invited, finally, to what I understood to be a small housewarming for a few of Danny's college friends at his and Vanessa's apartment, a Saturday afternoon thing, casual, and I'd driven down looking forward to it, more than I probably should have admitted out loud. When I arrived, Vanessa answered the door with a look that told me, before she said a single word, that something had gone wrong somewhere in the planning. Walter, oh, Danny didn't call you? She stepped back to let me in, glancing over her shoulder toward the kitchen. We actually moved the date up to next weekend. There was a scheduling thing with the caterer. I'm so sorry, I thought Danny had let you know. I could see, past her shoulder, a dining table already set for 8, a caterer's box on the counter, and Danny standing near the kitchen island in conversation with 2 people I recognized from the wedding photographs as Vanessa's cousins. It hadn't moved. It was happening exactly as scheduled, that day, at that hour, and I was the only person standing in that doorway who hadn't been told. I didn't make a scene. I told her it must have been a miscommunication, said hello to Danny from the doorway, told him I'd actually just been in the area and couldn't stay long, and watched his face shift, briefly, into something like genuine confusion, as though some part of him hadn't fully registered until that exact moment that I was standing there at all. "Dad, wait," I thought. He glanced toward the kitchen, toward Vanessa, something passing between them I couldn't quite read from the doorway. "I'll walk you out." He walked me down to the parking garage, apologizing the whole way in the vague, circling manner of a man who isn't entirely sure himself what he's apologizing for, and I told him it was fine, that I understood, that these things happen, the same two phrases I'd been reaching for all spring, like a man patting his pockets for keys he already knows aren't there. I hugged him goodbye in that parking garage, got in my truck, and sat there for a full minute before starting the engine, watching him walk back toward the elevator. Back toward a party that was, I now understood clearly, never actually meant to include me at all. I drove the 6 hours home with the radio off the entire way, turning over, in the quiet, the particular sting of standing in a doorway, watching a party happen around you that you were never actually meant to be part of at all. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, I pulled off at a rest stop and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes without any real reason to, just needing to stop moving for a while, needing the stillness to catch up with everything else that had been building quietly in me since a hotel hallway in April. The fourth piece came 10 days after that, and it was the one that finally moved me from quiet hurt into something closer to clarity. I'd mentioned to Danny in an otherwise ordinary phone call that I was thinking about driving down to visit him and Vanessa sometime that summer, just the three of us, nothing formal. He went quiet for a moment on the line and then said, "Actually, Dad, can we maybe wait until fall for that? Vanessa's got a lot going on with her firm's summer gala season, entertaining clients and stuff, and I think it'd honestly be easier." "Danny," I said, "am I not allowed to visit my own son's apartment?" "That's not what I said, Dad. Don't twist it. I'm not twisting anything. I'm asking a direct question. Is there a reason I keep getting scheduled around instead of scheduled in?" "Dad, where is this coming from all of a sudden?" "It's not sudden, Danny. It's been building since a hotel hallway in April, and I've been sitting on it for weeks trying to figure out whether it was really as clear as it kept looking, and every time I get another piece of it, it looks clearer, not less." "What's that supposed to mean? What pieces?" I almost told him everything right then, standing in my own kitchen with the phone pressed hard against my ear, nearly 6 weeks of quiet gathering suddenly straining against the door I'd been holding shut on it. But something in me, Deb's voice, maybe, or just the accumulated instinct of 31 years running a shop where you learn not to make a diagnosis before you've actually looked under the hood, held me back one more time. "I'll tell you when I'm ready to tell you all of it at once, Danny, not in pieces over the phone. I want to sit across from you when I say it." "That sounds ominous, Dad." "Maybe it should," I said, and neither of us said much of anything for the rest of that call. He didn't have a real answer for the original question, not right away, and the silence on that call stretched out long enough that I understood, with a kind of clarity that felt almost peaceful after weeks of confusion, exactly what shape this had actually taken. 4 separate moments now: the graduation dinner, the Easter gathering, the housewarming that moved without me, now a simple visit to his apartment, all quietly managed around the same unspoken concern. And my own son, whether through genuine blindness or a kind of exhausted conflict avoidance I recognized uncomfortably as my own, had gone along with every single one of them. I didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. I kept the shop open on schedule, kept my hands busy under hoods that didn't much care what was happening in the rest of my life. But in the quiet hours after closing, alone in the house I'd shared with Carol, and then with Danny, and now, most nights, just with myself, I found myself doing the thing Deb had specifically warned me against, laying every piece I'd gathered end to end and staring at the whole shape of it until I couldn't pretend anymore that it was anything other than what it plainly was. I thought about the day Danny was born, 26 years and 4 months earlier, how I'd stood in that hospital hallway in a state considerably more useless than the one I'd stood in outside that ballroom, waiting for a nurse to tell me I could finally come see my son, and how the second I held him I understood, in a way nothing before or since has ever matched, that my entire life had just quietly reorganized itself around keeping this one small person safe. I thought about every version of that promise I'd kept across 26 years. The nights I'd sat up with him through fevers, the summer I'd worked 2 extra shop shifts a week so he could go to the baseball camp he'd wanted, the year after Carol died when I'd learned to braid a tie from a video because there was nobody else left to teach him. I found myself, more than once during those sleepless nights, wondering what Carol would have made of all this. Whether her presence in Danny's life might have changed any of it, whether a mother's instinct might have caught what I'd apparently missed for 18 months, or whether Vanessa's family might have treated us both differently if there'd been two of us standing in that doorway, instead of one aging widower in a suit he'd bought specifically not to embarrass anyone. I don't know the answer to that, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing it, the same peace I've made with 100 other unanswerable questions since Carol died. What I do know is that she'd have said the exact same thing Deb said to me that first night in the hotel room. Get the facts first. Walt, don't finish the story yourself, because that was always Carol's way too, patient and clear-eyed even when patience cost her something. And I thought about a hotel hallway and a text about a head count and a boy I'd raised to be better than that, quietly agreeing to make me small enough to fit somewhere I wasn't wanted. I called Deb that same night and told her all three pieces laid out together for the first time. Walt, she said, after a long, quiet moment, I think you have your facts now. The question isn't what happened anymore. You know what happened. The question is what you're going to do with knowing it. I don't want to lose my son over this. You're not going to lose him by telling him the truth clearly and calmly, she said. You're at much greater risk of losing him slowly, over years, by letting this become the pattern that just quietly runs your relationship without either of you ever naming it out loud. I watched that exact thing happen to families for 30 years, Walt. The ones that survived it were the ones where somebody finally said the hard thing plainly, without screaming it, and gave the other person a real chance to actually hear it. I thought about that conversation for 4 more days before I finally called Danny and asked him to come to Millbrook alone, without Vanessa, to talk about something that mattered. He came on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from me at the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework as a boy, where I'd taught him to read a torque wrench, where his mother used to grade third-grade spelling tests with a red pen while dinner simmered on the stove behind her. Danny, I need to tell you some things, and I need you to actually hear them instead of getting defensive right away, because I've spent weeks trying to decide the right way to say this, and I don't think there is one. So I'm just going to say it plainly. I told him about Pete's text, about accidentally seeing it, about not confronting him that same day, because I wanted to understand the full shape of things before I said anything. I told him about Donna's call, about the Easter dinner and the comment about his Millbrook people. I told him about the pattern I'd noticed across the summer visit and the graduation dinner both, and I watched his face move through something I hadn't expected. Not defensiveness at first, but a kind of dawning, uncomfortable recognition, the particular expression of a person finally seeing something laid out in full that they'd only ever let themselves see in scattered, deniable pieces. Dad, he said finally, I didn't think about it as bad as you're describing it. I thought I was just managing a stressful situation, keeping the peace, not making a big thing out of small comments. Danny, your wife's family decided your own father wasn't refined enough for a dinner celebrating your graduation, and instead of telling me that directly or standing up for me in the room, you sent me a text about a head count error and let me sit alone in a hotel room that night wondering what I'd done wrong. I know, he said, quiet now, his voice cracking slightly in a way that took me back for a moment to a much younger version of him sitting at that same table after a hard day. I know, Dad. I've been telling myself it wasn't that serious, because admitting it would mean admitting I let it happen, over and over, without ever once pushing back. Why didn't you push back? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands on the table, hands that still, underneath a business school polish, carried the faint permanent evidence of a boy who used to change oil under my supervision every summer. Because every time I've tried, even a little, it turns into this whole thing where Vanessa gets hurt that I'm choosing sides, and her mom gets involved, and it becomes easier to just let it happen than to fight about it every single time. I told myself you were easygoing enough not to mind. I think I told myself that because it let me off the hook from ever having to actually stand up for you. Do you know what that looked like from where I was standing, Danny? 6 hours in the truck to get there. 2 nights in a hotel so I wouldn't show up tired. A new tie I bought specifically because I didn't want to embarrass you. And then a security guard telling me, as kindly as a stranger can tell you something like that I wasn't on a list for my own son's celebration. Dad, please? I'm not finished. I sat in that hallway and watched people walk past me into a room lit up for a party in your honor, and I called you, and it went to voicemail, and I stood there long enough that a hotel employee started to feel sorry for me. That's not a head count error, Danny. That's a decision somebody made about who was allowed to be proud of you in public and who wasn't. He put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked back up, his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager standing at his mother's casket, trying so hard not to cry in front of people that his whole body had shaken with the effort of holding it in. I keep telling myself it was one bad decision, one dinner, but you're right, it wasn't one thing, was it? It was the Easter dinner I didn't fight for you to be at. It was the housewarming that somehow got moved without anyone telling you. It was every single time this year I let somebody else decide how much room there was for you in my life, and just went along with whatever they decided. Why, Danny? I need you to actually answer that, not just agree with me that it happened. Because Vanessa's world felt like something I had to earn my way into, Dad. And somewhere in trying to earn it, I think I started treating you like a variable I needed to manage so I wouldn't lose my place in it. And I hate saying that out loud because it makes me sound like a person I don't want to be. But I think that's the honest answer. I didn't say anything for a while, letting that sit between us, because I could tell he wasn't finished reaching for the rest of it on his own. Dad, I need to actually deal with this. Not just apologize to you and go back to letting it happen the same way. I need to talk to Vanessa, and honestly, I think I need to talk to her mother too, because I don't think this stops unless I actually say something clearly, the way you just did with me. I'm not asking you to blow up your marriage over this, Danny. I'm asking you to stop treating your own spine like something optional whenever it's inconvenient. There's a difference between keeping the peace and disappearing entirely, and I think you've been doing the second one and calling it the first. I know, he said. I know that now. I don't think I let myself know it until you laid it all out like that, one thing after another. 2 weeks later, Danny called and asked if I'd be willing to come to a dinner at his and Vanessa's apartment, an actual dinner this time. Just the three of us, the kind of visit I'd been quietly scheduled around for months. I drove down uncertain what I'd find, and what I found, when Vanessa opened the door, was a woman who looked considerably less polished than I'd ever seen her before, and considerably more nervous, her hands twisting a dish towel she didn't seem to realize she was still holding. "Walter," she said, "thank you for coming. I know Danny told you some of what's been going on, and I owe you an actual conversation about it, instead of just letting it keep getting managed around." We sat down to a dinner she'd clearly put real effort into, a roast she'd apparently attempted twice. Judging by the slightly apologetic way she mentioned, the first one hadn't turned out right. And for the first 15 minutes, the conversation stayed carefully in safe territory. The new job, the apartment, small talk stretched thin over something much larger sitting unaddressed at the center of the table. I let it stretch the way Deb had taught me to, not filling silences that weren't mine to fill, waiting to see whether Vanessa would actually reach the harder conversation on her own or need it pulled out of her. She reached for it herself, about 20 minutes in, setting down her fork with a small, deliberate click against the plate. "I want to say something, and I want to say it honestly instead of the polished version I'd normally give." Her voice wavered slightly, and I watched Danny's hand find hers under the table, not to speak for her, just to steady her. When Danny and I got engaged, I think I was still figuring out how to belong in my own family's world, my parents' world, the country club, and the gala circuit, and all of it. And somewhere in trying to prove I fit into that, I started treating anything that didn't fit it as a threat to be managed instead of just a person. Your work boots, the shop, the way you talk. I turned all of that into a category in my head, instead of ever actually getting to know you as my husband's father. And I let my mother's comments slide instead of correcting her, because correcting her would have meant admitting I agreed with parts of what she was saying more than I want to admit even now. That's an honest thing to say. I told her, and I appreciate it. But Vanessa, an apology doesn't erase a room full of 14 people at Easter dinner discussing me like a liability, or a graduation dinner I drove 6 hours for and wasn't allowed into, or a housewarming that somehow moved dates without anyone telling me. Her composure slipped there, just slightly, the practiced ease she carried into most rooms cracking at the edges. "You know about the housewarming, too." "I stood in your doorway, Vanessa. I watched it happening." She closed her eyes for a moment. "God. Okay. That one wasn't even my mother. That one was entirely me. I panicked when Danny mentioned inviting you, because my cousin Whitney was going to be there. and she'd said something dismissive about, I don't even remember what, something small. And I didn't want to deal with both things happening in the same room, so I just told him the date had changed and hoped it would resolve itself quietly. I heard myself say that just now, and I understand exactly how it sounds. It sounds, I said, like I was a problem you were scheduling around, the same way you'd schedule around bad weather. I know. Her voice caught in a way that told me this wasn't the polished version either. I'm not asking you to just forgive it because I said sorry once at a dinner table. I know I have to actually show you something different, over time, before that apology means anything real. I don't expect you to trust it yet. Danny spoke up then, quiet but steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in months. Van, I need to say something too, and I need you to hear it the way I heard it from my dad 2 weeks ago. I let this happen as much as you did. Every time you scheduled around him, I went along with it instead of pushing back, because pushing back felt harder than just letting it slide. That's on me too, not just you. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, something passing between them that felt more honest than anything I'd witnessed across 4 polite, managed encounters over 18 months. I think we both got comfortable making him smaller so things would stay easy, she said quietly. That's an awful thing to realize about yourself. I want to be honest that I didn't leave that dinner with everything resolved, tied up neatly the way these things sometimes get told afterward. Vanessa didn't transform overnight into a different person, and I don't think that's how real change in anyone actually works. But something had shifted, plainly and honestly, in that kitchen, in a way that felt different from every carefully managed interaction across the previous 18 months. Over the following months, the shift held in small specific ways that mattered more to me than any grand gesture could have. Danny called every week now, real calls, not check-the-box calls, telling me about his new job, asking real questions about the shop, about how I was doing since that difficult weekend. Some weeks he called twice, sometimes for no particular reason at all, just to talk, the way we used to talk across the hood of a car on a Saturday morning when neither of us had anywhere else to be. He and Vanessa drove up to Millbrook for a full weekend in June, no country club version of things, just Sunday dinner at my kitchen table and an afternoon in the garage where Vanessa, to my genuine surprise, asked me to actually show her how an engine went together. Sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease on her forearm. She didn't seem in any hurry to wipe off. I want to actually understand this part of Danny's life, she told me that afternoon, turning a wrench under my hand with the particular concentration of someone determined not to be bad at something in front of the person she'd hurt. Not just tolerate hearing about it at dinner. I think I spent a year treating this shop like something Danny needed to grow out of instead of something that actually made him who he is. I got that wrong, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it plainly. We spent close to 2 hours out there that afternoon, and by the end of it she'd changed her first oil filter, badly but entirely on her own, and stood back from the car with a look of genuine pride on her face that reminded me oddly of Danny at 12, standing in that exact same spot for the very first time. Pete came by the shop that same weekend, having heard through Danny that things had shifted, and pulled me aside near the parts counter. Hey, Mr. Higgins, I probably shouldn't have let that text go as far as it did without saying something to you myself, honestly. I felt bad about it for weeks. You didn't do anything wrong, Pete. If anything, that text is part of why I finally understood what was actually happening. Still, he said, I'm glad it worked out. Danny's different lately. Lighter, I guess. Before that call, though, there was a smaller moment I want to mention, because it's the one that told me, more than almost anything else that summer, that something real had actually shifted rather than just being said aloud once and forgotten. Vanessa mailed me a card, unprompted, about a week after the garage afternoon, not for any occasion, no birthday or holiday attached to it, just a plain card with a handwritten note inside that read, in full. Walt, I've been thinking about the oil filter all week. I want to learn more. Also, I'm sorry it took an entire year and a ruined graduation dinner for me to ask. Thank you for teaching me anyway. V. I kept that card in the drawer of my nightstand, and I still take it out sometimes on hard days, because it's a small, ordinary thing, and small, ordinary things, I've come to believe, are usually a better measure of whether somebody's actually changed than any single grand gesture ever is. Danny called me one evening in mid-July, a few weeks after that garage afternoon, his voice carrying something I hadn't heard in him in a long while, a kind of settled, unhurried ease, the way he used to sound as a boy calling from a friend's house, just to tell me about his day, no particular reason. just wanting to talk. Dad, Vanessa told her mother today that if there's ever another family gathering where you're not invited, she's not coming either. Just like that, at dinner, in front of her whole family. How'd that go over? About how you'd expect. But she didn't back down, and I didn't either, for once. It felt different, Dad. It felt like the two of us actually being on the same side of something instead of me just going along with whatever kept things smoothest. That's good to hear, son. I keep thinking about that morning at your kitchen table, he said. How you laid it all out, one thing after another, and I kept waiting for you to raise your voice, and you never did. I think that's what actually got through to me. If you'd yelled, I probably would have gotten defensive and missed half of it. You just told me the truth calmly and let me sit with how bad it actually was. I learned that from Deb, if I'm honest. She told me feelings without facts just go in circles, and facts delivered calmly land harder than anger ever does. Well, it worked, he said. I don't think I'll forget that kitchen table for a long time. Danny's firm hosted a summer picnic for employees and families in August, and this time I was invited from the start. No scheduling around, no committee decision made without me. Danny called personally, 3 weeks in advance, and asked if I wanted to bring anything from the shop to talk about with his coworkers, half joking, half not, and I brought a box of old tools from my father's era that ended up drawing more curious conversation from Danny's colleagues than I ever expected a box of rusted wrenches could generate. One of his coworkers, a sharp young woman named Priya, who worked 2 desks over from Danny, spent a solid 20 minutes asking me questions about a hand-forged wrench my own father had used, turning it over in her hands like it was something out of a museum. Danny talks about the shop constantly, she told me. Honestly, more than he talks about anything else. I always pictured you as this whole legendary figure before I even met you. Legendary's a strong word for a guy who fixes transmissions, I said, and she laughed, and across the picnic table I caught Danny watching that exchange, with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long while. Something like pride, plain and unguarded. The kind he used to wear as a boy showing his friends around the shop on a school field trip. Vanessa found me later that afternoon, sitting alone for a moment near the drink table, and sat down across from me without any of the careful performance I remembered from our earlier encounters. I used to worry, before all this, that people here would ask about you and I'd have to figure out how to talk around it, she admitted. Today I just told Priya the truth. That you're Danny's father, and you run the shop that basically raised him, and that I'm lucky to be marrying into a family like that. It felt strange saying it, honestly. Strange that it took this long to feel true. It's all right that it took a while, I told her. What matters is it's true now. Danny found me an hour later, sitting near that same drink table, and sat down across from me without saying anything for a moment, just watching the picnic move around us. Coworkers tossing a football, kids from the office chasing each other around a cooler, Vanessa laughing with Priya near the grill. I used to think being proud of you and being proud of my life here were 2 separate things I had to keep in separate rooms, he said finally. Like I could only really succeed in one world if I kept the other one quiet. I don't know exactly when that started, but I know it's why I let all of this happen the way I did. And now? Now I think that was the whole mistake, he said. You're not a separate room, Dad. You're the foundation the rest of the house is built on. I don't know why it took a locked ballroom door to make me see that clearly, but I see it now, and I don't plan on unseeing it again. I invited Deb to that same Sunday dinner, introduced her properly to both of them, and watched Vanessa thank her, with what struck me as genuine warmth, for showing up for me the night I'd needed someone most. I did what any decent friend would do, Deb said, waving off some of the weight of it the same easy way she waves off most compliments. But I'll tell you both something. Walter never once said a harsh word about either of you during those weeks, even when he had every right to. I think that's worth remembering, whatever else you're both still working through. That comment seemed to land on Vanessa harder than almost anything else said that whole weekend, understanding that even in his hurt, I'd never used it as a weapon, and that the gentleness of that restraint had made the reality of what had happened even clearer to her than anger ever could have. Danny's firm hosted its own end-of-year gathering that October, and this time, unprompted, Danny called to invite me himself, no text, no committee decision made around me. Dad, I want you there. Not managed around, not scheduled in when it's convenient. There. And Vanessa specifically asked me to make sure I called instead of texted this time. I drove down for that dinner in the same suit I'd worn to the graduation, the tie still slightly creased from where it had hung untouched over a hotel chair 5 months earlier. And this time, when I gave my name at the door, it was there, spelled correctly, and Danny met me in the lobby himself, no phone call needed, and walked me in with his hand on my shoulder the way I used to walk him into his first day of school. Vanessa's mother, Renata, was there that evening too, and I want to be honest that I hadn't expected much from her, given everything I'd learned about the comments made at that Easter table. I found myself seated near her by chance during the cocktail hour, and for a while the conversation stayed exactly where I expected it to. Careful, thin, the kind of small talk two people make when they're both aware of a large unspoken thing sitting between them. About halfway through the evening, she found me again near the coat check, away from the noise of the main room, and her posture had changed, something less composed than the version of her I'd met at the country club engagement party years before. "Walter, I owe you a conversation I've been avoiding since Easter," she said. "Vanessa told me what was said at my table that day, in front of 14 people, and told me plainly that I'd made you into a joke without ever bothering to actually know you. I'd like to tell you I don't remember saying it, but I do remember, and pretending otherwise would just be another version of the same cowardice. I appreciate you saying that. Renata, I'm not going to pretend this fixes it, or that I've become an entirely different person since April," she continued. And there was something almost bracing about the honesty of that. More than a smoother apology would have offered. I still catch myself making assumptions about people I don't fully understand, and I probably will for longer than I'd like to admit. But I wanted you to know I heard my daughter clearly, and I'm sorry for the part I played in a decision that hurt you, and honestly, hurt her marriage more than either of us realized at the time. It wasn't a complete redemption, and I don't think either of us expected it to be. She didn't become warm exactly, not that night or in the months that followed. Our relationship since has settled into something careful and cordial rather than close, two people who've agreed, without ever quite saying so, to simply do better than they did before. But it was honest, and offered without being asked for, and I've come to believe that an incomplete apology, given freely, is worth considerably more than a complete one extracted under pressure. I found Vanessa near the coat check a few minutes later, and she must have seen something in my face, because she asked, quietly, whether her mother had finally said what she'd been meaning to say for weeks. "She did," I told her. "I made her practice it with me twice before tonight," Vanessa admitted, a small, rueful smile crossing her face. She kept trying to soften it into something that sounded more like an explanation than an apology, and I kept telling her that wasn't good enough anymore. "Not after everything." "You've changed a fair amount since April," I said. "I've had a lot of long nights to think about who I actually want to be in this family," she said. "I don't love who I was at that Easter table. I'd like to spend the rest of however long I know you proving I'm not her anymore." Last month, Danny and Vanessa hosted a small dinner of their own in Millbrook, at the new apartment they'd taken above the old hardware store on Main Street, 3 miles from my house. A decision Danny told me had as much to do with wanting to actually be near me again as it did with his new regional office being closer too. Deb came to that dinner, and Donna and even Pete stopped by for dessert, the kind of full, easy table I hadn't sat at since Carol was alive to fill the empty chair at the head of it. Danny had stopped by the shop the week before that dinner too, on a Saturday morning, still dressed for the office but rolling his sleeves up anyway, the moment he walked through the bay doors, the way he used to as a boy. Sal put him to work on a timing belt without a word of ceremony, and I stood at the register watching my son bent over an engine again, 26 years old with a business degree and a downtown job, choosing, on a free Saturday morning, to spend it exactly where he'd spent every summer of his childhood. "You didn't have to do this," I told him, handing him a rag when he finally straightened up, grease on his forearms, in a way that looked, to me, considerably more like belonging than any suit he owned. "I wanted to," he said. "I think I forgot for a while how much I actually liked this. Being here. Being your son in a place where that's just the whole thing. Not a category anybody has to manage." I sat there for a while that evening at the dinner just watching, the way I imagine most fathers eventually learn to do, letting the noise of a full kitchen wash over me, instead of needing to be at the center of it. Vanessa was teaching Donna a recipe she'd apparently learned from her own grandmother, flour on both their hands, laughing about something I didn't quite catch. Danny stood near the stove stirring a pot that didn't strictly need stirring, the way he used to hover near me in the garage as a boy, finding small reasons to stay close. Deb caught my eye from across the room at one point and gave me the smallest, knowing nod, the particular look of an old friend who watched you build something back up out of a night that had nearly broken you, and I nodded back, understanding it without either of us needing to say a single word about it. I sat at their table, watching my son and his wife move around a kitchen together. Easily, the way I once hoped, cautiously, a family might someday move together again. And I understood something I don't think I'd have understood as clearly without that lonely night in a hotel room, forcing all of it into the open. I thought, sitting there, about the version of that April evening I could have chosen instead. The version where I drove home from that hotel, swallowed the hurt the way I'd swallowed plenty of smaller hurts over the years, told myself it wasn't worth the risk of conflict, and let the whole pattern quietly calcify into the permanent shape of my relationship with my son and his wife. I think about how easily that could have happened, how close I came to letting Deb's careful patience become an excuse for never actually saying the hard thing at all, how many families I suspect never get past that exact fork in the road because saying the true thing out loud, calmly, to someone you love, is one of the hardest things a person is ever asked to do. I got lucky, in a way, lucky to have a friend like Deb who knew the difference between patience and avoidance, lucky to have a sister willing to make an uncomfortable phone call, lucky, in the end, to have raised a son with enough decency left in him to actually hear the truth once somebody finally laid it out plainly, instead of losing him to the comfortable version of things where nobody ever has to feel the weight of what they'd let happen. Donna came to Millbrook for Thanksgiving that year. The first one in 3 years Danny had made it home for, instead of splitting the holiday with Vanessa's family the way they'd done every year since the wedding. Vanessa came too, and helped Donna in the kitchen the whole afternoon, the two of them trading stories about Danny as a boy that had Donna laughing hard enough to need to sit down at one point, describing a science fair volcano that had, apparently, gone considerably further than intended, and left a permanent mark on our kitchen ceiling that's still faintly visible if you know exactly where to look. You know, Donna told me quietly, drying dishes together at the sink after the meal, watching Danny and Vanessa clear the table together in the next room. I wasn't sure, back in the spring, whether telling you about that Easter comment was the right thing to do. I went back and forth on it for weeks before I finally called you. I'm glad you did, I told her. I don't think any of this gets fixed if you don't. I almost didn't, she admitted. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I'd misheard the tone of it, that stirring things up wasn't worth the risk of you and Danny fighting over something I might have misread. But then I thought about Dad, and how nobody in this family ever said the hard thing out loud when it mattered, and I didn't want to be one more person in this family who saw something and stayed quiet about it. You were right to call, I said. It's the reason any of the rest of this happened. Deb and I sat on my back porch one evening that fall, not long after the October dinner, drinking coffee the way we'd taken to doing most weeks by then, and I asked her something I'd been meaning to ask since that first night in the hotel room. Deb, in 30 years of counseling kids, did you see this kind of thing often? Families quietly deciding who fits and who doesn't. More than you'd believe, Walt. I used to tell the parents who came into my office worried sick about a kid pulling away, it's almost never one big dramatic betrayal. It's 100 small decisions about who gets included in what, made so quietly that nobody involved even registers their choices at all, until one day somebody adds them all up and realizes how far apart everyone's drifted. The families that came back from it weren't the ones who never made those choices. They were the ones willing to add it all up honestly, instead of pretending the sum didn't exist. Is that what Danny and I did? That's exactly what you did, she said. You added it up, calmly, clearly, without turning it into a war. That's rarer than you'd think, Walt. Most people either let the sum sit there forever, silently resenting it, or they explode with it all at once and burn down more than they meant to. You did neither. That's the whole reason this actually healed instead of just scarring over. Sal retired from the shop this past winter, handing his tools over to a young mechanic I'd hired the year before, and at his small send-off gathering in the shop's front office, Danny showed up in work clothes instead of his office suit, insisting on helping set up the folding tables himself, the same way he used to help set up for Little League award nights as a boy. Sal pulled me aside near the coffee pot that afternoon, the same coffee pot that's been sitting in that waiting area longer than either of our careers. Your boy's different lately, Walt, he said. Good different. I remember him showing up that one Saturday looking like a stranger in his own family, and now look at him, mixing concrete for the new curb out front like it's the most natural thing in the world. He's finding his way back, I said. Took longer than I'd have liked, but he's finding it. Most people never do, in my experience, Sal said. Most people let the distance win because closing it feels harder than just accepting it. You two didn't. That's worth something, Walt. That's worth more than most people ever get around to understanding until it's too late to fix. Danny caught the tail end of that conversation, coming over with 2 paper cups of the shop's terrible coffee, one for each of us, and handed me mine with a small, knowing smile. Sal giving you the retirement wisdom speech? Something like that, I said. He gave me one too on my way in. Told me not to wait as long as you did to say the important things out loud. Danny took a sip of his coffee, wincing slightly at how bad it still was after all these years. I told him I was working on it. Being family was never really about who fits a particular vision of a certain kind of room. It was about who's willing to look honestly at the moments they got wrong, say so plainly, and actually change the pattern instead of just apologizing for it once and letting it continue. Deb taught me to gather the facts before I let hurt finish the story on its own. Danny is still learning what it means to stand up for the people he loves, even when it costs him something with the people he's trying to impress. Vanessa is learning that too, later than any of us would have liked, but learning it in a way that means considerably more to me now than a seat at any one dinner ever could have. If this story reminded you of a moment you've quietly let slide instead of naming clearly, or someone in your own family you've let get managed around, instead of simply included, maybe it's worth having that honest conversation today, rather than waiting for a locked ballroom door to force it into the open. It doesn't have to be a hotel hallway or a graduation dinner. Sometimes it's smaller than that, a birthday party quietly shrunk down, a holiday that keeps somehow not including someone, a pattern nobody's ever said out loud because saying it feels riskier than just letting it continue. Say it anyway. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about family, forgiveness, and the people who finally learn to show up.